where are you, Lois, is going to be Lois Austin. But Ollie, I'll ask you just to sort of kick off, please.
Thank you, Eve. I'm not going to talk much, just to thank everybody for coming, firstly, and I'm a little bit humbled because there are some very serious and weighty activists here who have contributed enormously to the struggle. We are a trades council. It means we have delegates from local union branches along, but we do invite people who live in the area who are supportive to come along to our meetings. And I do encourage people to do that if you're in Ealing, or to join your local trades council if you're somewhere else. Obviously, as everybody knows, we are here to talk about the Spycops and the anti-protest bills, and I imagine everybody here has got at least a rough understanding, and our speakers are going to talk about that even more. It's amazing to me how scared the government is of us. They're scared of the communities. They were particularly frightened, I thought, rather amusingly, by the attacks on statues of murderers and slavers that you would have thought were historical figures, but it seemed to scare the hell out of them. And the right-wing government and all the employers, it seems clear, are taking advantage of the COVID crisis to get all of their horrible plans out of the drawer, whether it's in terms of repressive legislation or whether it's in terms of cutting pay and conditions, and using the pandemic crisis as an opportunity to try and bring those in. So we do need a strong response, and hopefully we can contribute a little bit towards that with some of the discussion here tonight. We've got a really good lineup of speakers that you have read about. So without further ado, I'm just going to ask Eve to introduce the speakers one by one, and then we can have some discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm absolutely delighted. Lois came and spoke to our trades council. She was absolutely superb, and I expect her to be just as good today. No pressure, Lois. So Lois Austin is from the campaign opposing police surveillance with the lovely acronym of COPS. Yeah. So Lois, over to you, and thank you very much for agreeing to speak today.
Okay, thanks, Eve, and thanks for that introduction. And it's good to be back. And hello to my PCS comrades that I can see in the meeting. It's good to see you all. So I think it's absolutely right that we link in the sets of repressive legislation around curtailing and banning the right to protest, that we link in that with what is currently going on with the undercover police inquiry, or as it's become known, the Spycops inquiry, because the two things are inextricably linked. And you would think, wouldn't you, that if this inquiry, police, surveillance, infiltration, not just the police, by the way, secret services and other parts of the state, which has now been proven, which I'll go into, but surveillance, infiltration, intrusion, an attempt to derail and to destroy parts of the British Labour movement, whilst that inquiry is going on, that hopefully at some point will make recommendations to make sure those sorts of things don't happen again in the future. Whilst we're in the middle of that, this government is rushing through the most repressive legislation, really, that we've had in this country since the Second World War. And I won't go in too much into the legislation and what it means, because I think John is going to do that. But the three sets of legislation, first of all, the CHIS bill, which is a Spycops bill, which basically gives undercover intelligence sources, so that can be police officers, member secret services. It gives them immunity from prosecution if they commit a criminal offence while undercover. So, and that's now legislation. So the sort of things that we're currently campaigning against which is featuring in the undercover police inquiry. So police officers deceiving women into intimate sexual relationships. We know of 30 women, there are probably more, but 30 women who have come forward to say that they were the victim of a police officer abusing them in the most awful way and deceiving them into an intimate relationship. 3 of those women had children by undercover police officer, not knowing that the father of their child actually was somebody else and was an undercover police officer. We know that these undercover police colluded directly, so a public state body colluded directly with the private blacklisting organisations. We know that they stole the name of deceased children, and we know that they fitted up, they set up crimes, or they set up protests. They arranged for everybody on that protest to be arrested, and protesters and activists from our movement have got criminal convictions because of the activities of undercover political police officers. So this new legislation basically would mean that if those things happen in the future, and we presume they're still happening now, then they will be given immunity from prosecution. And also the legislation, the police crime sentencing and courts bill that's currently going through Parliament, the government fact sheet actually describes that as legislation that will be able to stop non-violent protest if it is going to have any disruptive effect on preempting that and rushing through this legislation shows what this government is really up to, but also shows that there is an attempt at a cover-up really of what has gone on in terms of undercover policing. Now, I'll give you a quick update on the undercover police inquiry. I'm a core participant. I'm a member of the Socialist Party. I was spied on in the 90s by the whistleblower Peter Francis, because I grew up in Welling in southeast London, where the BNP set up their headquarters in 1987. And I was involved at that time, and particularly into the 90s, after the murder of 4 young black men in that part of southeast London. I was involved in organising the big mass protests to close down the BNP. So the whistleblower, the undercover police officer Peter Francis, member of the Special Demonstration Squad, which was part of Special Branch, was told to set up a special branch file on me, because whilst there was a MI5 file on me for my political activity, there wasn't a special branch file on me. So that's why he blew the whistle about 10 years ago now, and that's why I've been given core participant status in the public inquiry. When all of this came to light, myself and others, socialist lawyers, trade unions, blacklisted workers, the women that had been deceived into relationships, we set up the campaign opposing police surveillance, working closely with the Police Spies Out of Lives campaign, and also working with Suresh in the monitoring group and the family justice campaigns. So we try to work as a collective, as an umbrella organisation, really trying to make sure exposing what's gone on. We think that we've been able to shine a great big light on the murky world of undercover political policing in this country and all that's gone on, but also fighting to get the public inquiry to be a genuine public inquiry, a public inquiry which gets to all, which investigates all of the evidence and exposes what has gone on. Unfortunately, at the moment, that is not what is happening. And we have got, we think, an attempt by the state at a cover-up. Most of you probably don't even know that the undercover police inquiry has been going on. It's taken 6 years since the inquiry was set up to actually get to the evidence hearings, which began last November. The Judge Mitting, is refusing to live stream the public inquiry. So, you know, it's a public inquiry which is taking place in secret. The only people who can go and watch the inquiry are core participants who are allowed into a hotel in central London. And of course, if you don't live in central London, or you're vulnerable to COVID or anything like that, then you're not able to come and listen and watch for yourself the public inquiry. So we're campaigning for a whole number of things around the public inquiry, which we need your support for. We are campaigning for disclosure. None of us have had our files, and the police get to see the files of those people who have been spied on before we get to see them, and they get to redact everything that they want to redact. We're campaigning that the inquiry is extended to Northern Ireland and Scotland, because at the moment it's just Wales and England, but we know that these spies were active in Scotland. They were certainly active in Northern Ireland. There's a whole load of stuff that's come up about police spies, special branch spies into campaigns that were showing solidarity to Irish people during the 1970s and the 1980s. And we're also campaigning for the inquiry to look at what these undercover police did abroad, because we know that Peter Francis, my spy, followed me and other anti-racist activists to Germany, where we took part in an anti-racist, anti-fascist youth camp in Germany in 1994, and Peter Francis was at that camp, and his handler Bob Lambert, who was at one point was the leader of the person in charge of the Special Demonstration Squad, was staying in a hotel just up the road in Germany. So there's a number of things that we're campaigning for to make this inquiry a genuine inquiry which attempts to get at the truth of what went on, but then also makes recommendations to make sure it doesn't happen again in the future. But having said all of that, there are a number of things that have been revealed so far which prove what we have said all along, that number one, this is political policing. Out of the 1,000 organisations that have been spied on, only 3 of them were organisations of the far right. What does that tell you about the neutrality of the British state, the police, secret services, the Home Office that set up, we now know the Home Office set up the Special Demonstration Squad 1968, 1969 in response to mass protests against the Vietnam War. What does it tell you about the neutrality of the state? In fact, we've gone so far as to say that the Special Demonstration Squad officers were picked, it appears, were picked for their right-wing views, but also we now know that MI5 were heavily involved in the Special Demonstration Squad. And what's been revealed, as I said to you, there is an attempt at a cover-up, but nevertheless we have seen some stuff that's been revealed. And you can go on the Undercover Police Inquiry website and have a look for yourselves, and you can see the reports of the undercover police officers who infiltrated anti-Vietnam solidarity campaign meetings, infiltrated meetings of trade unions, infiltrated socialist group meetings. And you can see that up in the corner, right-hand corner on their reports, is box 500. Now, if that box was ticked, that report went straight to MI5. And I can tell you that every report, and Suresh will bear this out, who's also been looking through this evidence, every report went straight to MI5. So what we're saying is that it was MI5 that was in control of the Special Demonstration Squad, which, as I said, was set up in 1968, 1969. It was then replaced in the early noughties by the MPOIU, another unit that was involved in spying on the left, on trade unionists, on family justice campaigns and progressive campaigns. We also know, I know I've been speaking for a while, so I'll finish now because I know there's other speakers. We also know that 13 socialist MPs were spied on. So Diane Abbott was spied on, Ken Livingstone was spied on, Dave Nellis was spied on. And we know as well, and Dave Nellis always makes this point, that for the police to get permission, or secret services to get permission to spy on an MP, they have to get permission from from the Prime Minister. So what we've said all along is that this isn't a rogue unit. This goes to the heart of the activity of the British state. Most people going around their normal lives wouldn't consider that the state behaves in this way. But what this shows is that the state, as I said, is not neutral and has had a campaign against activists, progressive organisations and the British Labour movement for many decades. And actually Gareth Peirce was very good in her opening statement at the public inquiry. Gareth Peirce is representing the National Union of Mine Workers, and the NUM have got core participant status. And she said that the British state spent 3 decades trying to destroy the NUM, and once they did it, they were able to fundamentally change the infrastructure of our society. And of course we know that, don't we? We always say at our meetings that the Thatcher government had to get the miners out of the way to carry through a programme of privatisation and cuts and all of that. Now I will finish on the comments of Lord Tebbit, and we had a meeting just a couple of weeks ago in Parliament hosted by Richard Bergen MP, trying to get support from MPs for our demands to make the public inquiry a public inquiry. And Lord Tebbit, Norman Tebbit, better known as the Chingford skinhead, gate crashed our meeting, and he actually admitted at the meeting that while he was employment minister between 1982 and 84, that he regularly met with union officials from the EETPU, which was the engineering union of the time, and special branch officers to discuss and work out how they were going to deal with left-wing activists in that union. So we was all like, oh! Because we've said all along that that this goes to the top. The British government were involved in this, ministers were involved in it, and there you have it from the horse's mouth. And there were claims that he repeated the following day in the national press. So we are now demanding, as is Unite Union and the Blacklist Support Group, that Norman Tebbit is called by Mitting, the judge, to the undercover police inquiry to give evidence. And we've got some questions for Norman Tebbit. We want to know how many workers were blacklisted because of Norman Tebbit's intervention into the EETPU. How many negotiations were derailed, so workers lost pay rises and the terms and conditions were worsened and all of that. How many workers were sacked due to Norman Tebbit's intervention into the British trade union movement? So and of course the outcome for the Shrewsbury 24 last week, the fantastic win, again shows that there was collusion. I'm finding out that collusion from the very top of the British state. Ted Heath, Prime Minister, okayed that terrible documentary Red Under the Beds, and also a branch of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office was also involved in stitching up the Shrewsbury 24. So what we want is support from all of you, which we've had lots of support in the past for our campaign. We've got a motion to go to trade unions. We want to lever the power of the trade union movement to put pressure on the undercover police inquiry to try to meet our demands, disclosure, give us the cover names of the undercover police officer, names of the organisations spied on, and so on. So thank you very much.
Right, Ollie, perhaps we can unmute people for a second if they'd like to clap. I am trying to unmute. Here we are. If anyone wants to give a quick clap, you can unmute yourselves briefly. Oh, good, shocking
well
stuff.
done, Louise.
Thank you very much. Mute you all again. Yes, and then I'm going to unmute Suresh. Where is he? Suresh. Here we are. Suresh, you can now unmute yourself. Where are you, Suresh?
Yeah, I'm here.
Ah, you're there. Brilliant, Suresh. So may I introduce, so I think you don't need much introduction, Suresh. This is Suresh Grover from the monitoring group. He's an extremely well-known national campaigner against the repressive policing, a very good anti-racist campaigner. I don't think you need too much of an introduction for me. Thanks very much, Suresh, for agreeing to speak today. I'm sure we're all looking forward to it. Thanks, Suresh.
Thank you so much, Eve, for inviting me to this gathering. I think I understood Oliver rightly when he put me as one of the Stephen Lawrence campaigners, and I saw the Spycops title that I was going to speak on the Spycops inquiry. If I have misunderstood, I apologize. So I am going to look at the issue of police spying from a race lens, and here it is. And I look at the context of policing in a racialized society and a class society. So I think everybody understands that the history of British policing is scattered with a catalogue of mistakes, racism, misogyny, misconduct, cover-ups, corruption, and spying. If you look at a report of the Her Majesty's Inspectorate in 2015, when the Spycops inquiry was announced, it reported, and I quote, "When corruption is uncovered, there is a tendency within the organization, including the police service, to suggest or imply that the problem is one that is confined to a few rogue members or bad apples. The canard can be dealt with quickly. First, while it is perfectly possible on occasion for an individual or a small number of individuals to engage in highly unethical conduct, the history of policing has too many examples of institutionalized corruption for this explanation to carry much credence." This is the Inspectorate's report, page 7, 2015. What this statement implies is that corruption in the police force and in the state is not an exception, but is actually more widespread than we think. And the evidence suggests that this is a wake-up call on people who want to understand the root causes of issues developing from policing. In fact, the catalyst for establishing the Spycops inquiry was driven by allegations of corruption in the Stephen Lawrence case. Soon after the conviction of the suspects in 2012, media articles suggested that corruption within the police service and named 2 officers, one of whom had allegedly revealed his corrupt relationship with one of the murderer's father. The information was known to senior New Scotland Yard officers in July 2018, when the Lawrence inquiry was still ongoing, but they chose to hide this fact from the chair of the inquiry. And this is exactly the same time when we in the campaign and the Lawrence legal team was pleading with Macpherson, the chair of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, not to close the book on corruption at that moment. Lois has said that there are a range of issues which arise from the Special Demonstration Squad of the Metropolitan Police. It's legality, its authority to what it wants and where the authority comes from, whether it's from the higher echelons of British establishment, and whether it can ever be held accountable for its misconduct, stealing children's identities to hide their real children's names to hide their identities, grooming, targeting women activists, fathering their children, infiltrating protest groups, blacklisting trade unions, campaign groups that was just simply trying to hold the state to account, and obviously spying of left-wing political figures and parties. One of the greatest issues from police spying is their actual involvement in planning and carrying out criminal acts. The lawyer who examined some of these actions stated that undercover officers knew the evidence used to gain conviction against activists was false. They hid vital evidence which could have gained acquittals, and they knew that the evidence that was used by the prosecution to prosecute campaigners was false, and they gained those convictions. And already as a result of that revelation, 50 campaigners have had their sentences quashed and overturned. According to Peter Francis, who I think also spied on Lois and her group, the police weren't just infiltrated in groups, but in justice campaigns, but also sabotaged their activity in a couple of campaigns to do with deaths in custody. They went in, convinced the family that it wasn't worth campaign. When the family tried to campaign again, they spread lies, and the families decided not to proceed with that campaign. The police excuse or justification of spying on Black justice or brown justice campaigns is that we are part of a collateral intrusion. They allege that the spying of family campaigns wasn't direct. Instead, many of us was simply came to their attention because we were being infiltrated by left-wing groups or came in contact with left-wing figureheads. This has no credence whatsoever. This does not relate to the actual situation and existence and political actions that many of us were taking at that moment. This isn't a leap in logic here, but a cursory examination of their assertion raises alarming consequences. Amongst your audience today, Eve, is a very formidable campaigner called Sukhdev Reel. I've just seen her name. She's the mother of Ricky Reel. You know, I've worked with her from 1997 when her son went missing and we looked for him. He was chased, racially abused, chased, and fell into River Thames. We know, as Louisa said, left-wing figureheads and politicians were spied upon. Just imagine the situation. And this is actually what happened. When Sukhdev rang me on the 15th of October, a day after Ricky went missing, I actually went to John's office, one of your speakers, and asked him to help. He came with me and we met the family. The police's assertion is Sukhdev has been spied upon, not because of her tenacity and her determination, but by simply associating and solely associating with somebody like John, whose colleagues have also co-participants in the inquiry. What does that tell you? MPs seeing their constituencies actually bring harm to their constituencies because of policing practice and corruption. It's staggering that they can say that. Let me just, the narrative on collateral intrusion simply does not add up. There is extensive body of evidence showing that the British state took the politics of Black power and activism seriously, and they took the threat of potential likelihood of civil unrest in the 1960s because of what was happening in the United States. Rather than deal with the underlying causes of discrimination, the British state began to carry out covert operations against Black organizations and activities. For instance, newly released state documents confirmed that during the summer of 1967, Special Branch and MI officers carried out covert operations in Hyde Park in London against members of the Universal Colored People's Association. They actually spied on the Indian Workers Association, GB, in Birmingham when they invited Malcolm X to speak at their convention in 1965. As predicted, civil unrest did explode in the UK, but not in the 1960s, although there were frequent race-related public disturbances in 1970s, and we know these existed and took place in areas like Southall. British inner cities and towns finally exploded 40 years ago in 1981. And unfortunately, for the very reason that the British intelligence had feared, in fact, what they said, racial disadvantage. is the very term that British intelligence used and the term that Lord Scarman uses when he analyzes the causes of the Brixton swamp operation and the riots that took place in April at Brixton in 1981. What does the state do? Instead of addressing the potent presence of and impact of racism, it begins to undermine, just like the 60s, and sabotage the work of those very people and organizations who were fighting for the extension of democratic rights, for women, for workers, for racialized communities, and those advocating a greater peace and an end to war and misery and death. We have, in the monitoring group, participated in 4 public judicial inquiries: Victoria Klimbia, Zaid Muharraq, Stephen Lawrence, and the Granville inquiry. When this inquiry was announced in 2015, we actually went and asked people to become co-participants. 5 years have passed by, and we remain in absolute darkness over disclosure of the identity of people who are purported to have spied on us. Not a single shred of material has been provided to me apart from one document I received last week. And this is quite ironic. It is an annual report of the STS in 1983, and it says that the National Campaign Against the Police Bill was spied upon. I happen to be the co-chair of the National Campaign Against the Police Bill in 1983. And I went around in mass protest carrying out placards saying, kill the bill, as an opposition to the 1984 Police and Criminal Evidence Act, because of some of the provisions in that legislation came from Northern Ireland, issues to do with creating sterile areas, which was used against the miners much later on, issues to do with intimate body searches that came from Northern Ireland, etc., etc. But I have no idea what information they have on me, despite the fact that I was the co-chair of the National Campaign Against the Police Bill. We don't even know at what stage we are going to give evidence, although we possess an accumulated knowledge and information spanning over 40 years. Will this spy inquiry give justice to those who have become victims of unlawful police spying? I think the answer at the moment is absolutely but soberingly no, not in this climate. It hasn't lifted the veil of state secrecy. It doesn't possess the independence will that it requires, nor the judicial courage to negotiate what I consider to be the landmines that have been dug in by the present government. They include, as somebody has referred to, the Covert Human Intelligence Bill, which makes the inquiry totally redundant because it has given powers to the security service and questionable collection of public bodies. The bill in its allows officers to commit crimes, including murder and torture, not only in the interest of national security, but also on the discurting vague grounds that they are in the interest of the economic well-being of the United Kingdom. And CRED. Let me say a few words about the Commission for Race Disparity and why that is relevant for us, our understanding. And I'll only be a couple of minutes and finish on this. The entire purpose of CRED, the commission headed by Tony Sewell, is to cancel institutional racism in social policy and political language. Immediately after the publication of the report, its chair said that while there was anecdotal evidence of racism, there was no proof that there was institutional racism in Britain. As it happens, we in the monitoring group and many others predicted this would happen as soon as CRED was launched in the summer last year. In fact, we wrote to Johnson and said that he must remove Tony Sewell because of his homophobic stance and views. and his comments on the BLM movement and issues to do with race. We then threatened legal action. And the response of the Cabinet Office to us was that not only will they disregard the decision of a judicial review, a judge at the High Court, and impose Tony's will again, if they lose the judicial review, they will seek to make exemplary damage costs against us, something in the turn of £70,000. It's incredible that the Prime Minister, the Cabinet Office, was willing to throw the entire kitchen sink and the whole legal armory at a charity like the Monitoring Group. The report itself, and I think most people know this, and I don't want to repeat much of it, only to make some salient points, and that is, it whitewashes discrimination in employment, deaths in custody, stop and searches. On stop and searches, for example, the policing and policing of Black communities in the capital has become more widespread, intrusive, and detention-centered. Sorry, is somebody trying to speak to me? I'm being told that I must stop.
Suresh, I think you really are going to have to wind up as good as you are.
Okay, so, all right. Although what I'm going to do is just, I'm sorry about this. I'll just finish in this way. We know that the government has refused to implement important recommendations from other inquiries dealing with race. But I think all of us know that this resistance, the inquiry, exists only because of the bravery and tenacity of activists, trade unionists, anti-racists, etc., and that it has substance because we together, every time we see injustice, we tremble with indignation, and that our conviction is derived from our unshakable spirit of protesting, of holding state to account, Black and white men and women, and by our fearless audacity and by our collective actions, whatever the outcome, our resistance will go on and our dream for a better world will never die. Thank you very much.
I think people might want to show their appreciation. Suresh, sorry for cutting you off. Thank you, brilliant. Thank you. Right.
It's a meeting, just so.
Right. Brilliant. Okay. I think I'm unmuted. So I'm going to move speedily on. Thank you again. Thanks both Lois and to Suresh with two great speeches. Can I introduce Deepa Govindarajan Driver? Deepa is from the unit. She's a lecturer in the UCU.
Okay.
Oh God, we are not properly muted.
I'm going to mute everybody. Right. Eve, unmute.
Right, try again.
Yeah.
So Deepa is in the UCU. She's from the Society of Haldane Lawyers, and she's has been very active in the Julian Assange campaign. So thank you very much, Deepa, for coming along tonight to speak to us. Deepa, where are you? Yeah.
I'm here. Hi.
Great.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
It is a privilege to be here and talking alongside some really long-standing campaigns. And my contribution today is going to be a little bit about what's happening with Julian Assange and relating it to some of the serious problems we see in relation to the right to free speech, the right to associate, the right to protest, and the right to dissent. I'm getting a bit of an echo, Eve. I don't know if there's a problem with the.
I think everybody is muted. I'll mute myself.
Thank you.
Yeah. Perhaps, Deepa, you could talk a little bit louder. Somebody said they were hard of hearing.
Okay, I'll try. Is that better? I'll pretend I'm on a picket line. So when we think of WikiLeaks, I think it's worth thinking back to the case of Khaled El-Masri, who is a German citizen who was abducted on the Macedonian border. He was abducted by 8 CIA agents who captured him, sodomized him, and then tortured him for 3 months. At which point they realized that Mr. El-Masri, who was an ordinary tourist on holiday, wasn't the person they were trying to abduct in the first place. Not that this kind of sodomy or torture is acceptable towards anybody, but they suddenly realized this is the wrong person. It's a case of mistaken identity. And then the CIA decided to sit on it for a further 3 months while they had internal wranglings about how they were going to deal with it. Mr. El-Masri was then released one night in Albania. He thought he was going to be shot in the back of the head when he was dropped off on the Albanian border. He was picked up by Albanian police and then repatriated back to Germany, where, given what he had experienced and given various other things, nobody believed his story. And it took him several years and the release of WikiLeaks files to allow him to seek justice at the European Court of Human Rights, which found in his favor, thanks to WikiLeaks documentation. WikiLeaks documentation also revealed that the CIA and the Americans had put pressure on the German government not to acknowledge what had happened to Mr. El-Masri and not to pursue the 8 CIA officers who would have been, obviously, for their wrongful confinement and torture and mistreatment of Mr. El-Masri, would have deserved punishment. Mr. El-Masri's case is, like I think Suresh was saying earlier, this was not a case of, one spy cop or one Secret Service agent or a small group of Secret Service agents doing something wrong. It was remarkably similar to the 780 odd detainees who had been sent to Guantanamo intentionally by the US, because Guantanamo was treated as though it was outside US law, and therefore these prisoners at Guantanamo had no rights to any due process, no rights to habeas corpus. And the Islamophobia that accompanied the fact that all these men were Muslim men, ranging in age from young teenagers, 14, 15, to very elderly people, who were force-fed peanuts rectally, who were tortured, who were really horrendously experimented on with various techniques, including waterboarding, and who during their time were subject to so much horror that we would not have known had it not been for the courage of Chelsea Manning, a whistleblower, who revealed via WikiLeaks what had really happened. And what Chelsea did was absolutely remarkable and absolutely admirable. But what WikiLeaks was trying to do was to allow, as you probably know, Chelsea was then tortured. She was put in a box and thereafter put in a cell for several years, where she was denied any clothes because she was deemed a suicide risk. The light was kept on in her cell for all through the day. She was allowed to exercise for 1 hour at 2 in the morning. She was forced to, she was denied her humanity as well as a result of what she revealed. So what Julian and WikiLeaks had done was to allow whistleblowers, people like you and me, to release information securely. While many of us, I guess, use for work perhaps, or for other reasons, Dropbox to electronically share large bits of information. And you will remember that before WikiLeaks came along, we had newspapers which were in print, and all of a sudden we had this electronic age where you had vast amounts of information and vast amounts of material being stored online that whistleblowers sought to reveal but had to find a secure way of revealing. And WikiLeaks and Julian Assange envisaged that secure way of providing the materials, which kept the whistleblower anonymous, so the whistleblower was secure, but also ensured the security of the documentation. And you can see that what they have done is absolutely outstanding, because to this day, WikiLeaks has a 100% record of accuracy. And you can think for yourself how many mainstream journalists would be able to approach anything near it. And WikiLeaks was also very important because it allowed for information which is, which was interesting to the Guardian, to the New York Times, to the Washington Post, and the mainstream newspapers, which are looking at world issues, and information that was relevant to local papers, such as in Tunisia, where there was a serious change of government as a result of WikiLeaks' exposures of corruption. Similarly, WikiLeaks allowed for release of information related to, for those of you who are interested in environmental matters, toxic waste dumping off the Ivory Coast by a company called Trafigura, so corporate misfeasance. And there is loads of information on WikiLeaks in relation to TTIP and the secret negotiations which allow corporations to sue poor countries and allow them to have a greater status than the citizens of those countries. So what WikiLeaks did was kind of create a kind of new kind of journalism that dealt with the problem of oligarchic press barons who controlled the acceptable range of debate, who controlled what we were allowed to think about and talk about. And they also harnessed technology. They allowed for whistleblowers to be secure. And most of all, they allowed ordinary people to surveil the state. Rather than the state having all these cameras and surveilling us, whether we're online on Zoom or through other mechanisms, they allowed us to understand the crimes that our governments and powerful corporations are committing in our name. And in doing all this, Julian set a fantastic example for the rest of us, in that the information that WikiLeaks provided could be used by activists like you to go ahead and to change the things we wanted to change in society, and to make this place, for many of you who are socialists, a better world where we can do things together. And as a result of this, the US government really went after him. Michael Pompeo named WikiLeaks a non-state hostile intelligence agency. A number of people, including Hillary Clinton, promised to drone him. Or kill him in other ways. Julian was then, many of you will, I suspect some of you will feel very uncomfortable about supporting Julian Assange, because you will have heard about the Swedish allegations, and a lot of people talk about them as the Swedish charges, and there were never any charges. The case was kept in preliminary investigation stage for over 7 years, opened and closed 3 times, and largely it was kept at that stage because of the collusion and the intentional undermining of the rule of law by Keir Starmer's CPS, who wrote to the Swedish authorities not to interview Julian in London when he offered to do so, and not to allow him. He wanted an assurance that if he went to Sweden to be interviewed, he would not be onward rendited to the US, as Sweden had done because of its NATO alliances with the US, with 2 other Egyptians who had sought asylum in Sweden, or who were on Swedish territory. And because of this, they managed to use smears, just like they used fake anti-Semitism smears within the Labour Party, to alienate those people who genuinely, especially on the left, care about issues related to domestic violence, in relation to rape, in relation to murder, in relation to... And one of the things that Lisa Longstaff at Women Against Rape says is that the dehumanization of Julian Assange was always about covering up the crimes of the state, the rapes, murders, and tortures, the hundreds of thousands of people who died in Iraq and Afghanistan, men, women, and children, whose lives didn't matter. And for any of you who still have a slight doubt in your mind about the Swedish allegations, you must remember that the Metropolitan Police, we know from Freedom of Information requests, spent tens of millions of pounds surveilling the Ecuadorian embassy. The US spied on privileged legal conversations that Julian had with his lawyer, Gareth Pierce, and with a number of his lawyers. And these tens of millions weren't done because this state does not spend more than 2% of its does not deal with better than 2% of rape cases. They did it because Britain is complicit in the murders, rapes, and tortures that are taking place overseas. And British politicians have been involved, including Alan Duncan, as some of you who might have glanced at the Daily Mail before throwing it in the bin will know from recent revelations, were involved in denying Julian Assange his Ecuadorian citizenship. You know, within the Ecuadorian embassy, the maximum he could walk was 15 meters in any direction, which meant that he lost his peripheral vision. He has history of depression, but it got particularly worse because of the confinement, prolonged confinement, where he was not able to attend the funeral of his mentor. He had asked for 1 hour to go and attend the funeral. He had a serious dental problem, which needed hospital treatment, and the Ecuadorian consul wrote to the British to ask for permission to go to the hospital, and he was not allowed. Similarly, a shoulder injury, which continued to fester. To this day, he has a chronic lung condition that began in 2012. And the time in the Ecuadorian embassy, most people assumed he was safe, he was okay. And then many people woke up when they saw how he was dragged out and put in Belmarsh. In the process where he was taken to Belmarsh, the judge at the magistrate's court asked him his name and his date of birth, and then ruled that he was a narcissist. That the undermining of due process has been consistent. Through the process, I was the legal observer at the hearings for his extradition. I have been astonished at the inhumane way in which he and his family have been treated. Every morning, he was the night before and the morning before he was tried for the first time. He was strip searched 5 times, moved from cell to cell. He had his privileged papers taken away from him. And this is somebody who only received notice of what he was being tried about, the second superseding indictment, a few weeks before he was going into the battle of his life, where he faced 175 years in a US supermax, where he would be treated worse than, you know, in a hugely horrendous way, where he would be entombed in concrete in an 8x10 cell at max. And the idea is that you get individual recreation by being moved once a day for 1 hour to the adjacent exactly same cell. And he will be allowed to, if he is extradited, he will be allowed to speak to his family twice a month, only under FBI surveillance. Neither he nor his lawyers will be allowed to talk to the press. And this is in pre-trial detention, even before he's tried and convicted. This is a shame. And the treatment of legal observers in the court process, we were, 40 human rights observers in us, including Amnesty International and the Haldane Society, were told, and others were not given permission to, first given permission, and then the permission was withdrawn for us to monitor the trial. 5 seats were allowed for the family, 2 for the members of the public. And it moved to 5 after we found that 3 seats had been left empty for diplomats who never turned up through the 4 weeks of the hearings. And what strikes me about all of this is that there's a complete shamelessness about, about an authoritarian state, and in the case of Julian, 5 authoritarian states stamping on the head of an individual. And that these authoritarian states, just as in withdrawing our right to protest, making illegal acts like rape and torture and murder legal through things like the CHIS bill, the Spycops bill, and changing our perception of what is legal or illegal through smears, is the very reason why we must stand up for each other. The case of Julian Assange is not just about Julian Assange. He's one individual. He has very young children, and it's awful and it's horrible. But it's also about our rights to understand what's really going on, because many of these things, whether it's the NHS, where there is huge amounts of corruption now, and there is backdoor privatization going on, and has been going on with, even during the time of Labour, whether it is other institutions, the army, the war zones, whether it is internally, whether your local playing field is being privatized, all this corruption cannot be known unless you understand what's happening behind the institution. And that's why whistleblowers are important. That's why journalists and publishers are important, who have the courage to tell us what's really going on, who don't hide, who don't manipulate the narrative. And it is really important that those of you who have other connections within your local trade unions or other groups, I'll put my number in the chat once we're permitted to chat. I'm very happy to be contacted. I'd be happy to talk to your local group. We have to come together and we have to stand for ourselves, because all of this is about power, about elites and powerful people constraining what we can do. And this power is further strengthened through propaganda, which is through controlling the media.
Or I'm going to have to ask you to stop.
I just wanted to say I'm happy to be contacted, and I'm grateful to be here, and thank you for allowing.
Thank you so much. That was just amazing. Like, all our speakers have been absolutely fantastic. Can we unmute everyone at the moment? Because I think, you know, we.
Thank you very much, Deepa. I was waiting for these comments for a long time. Thank you. Brilliant.
I listen to John McDonnell.
Right.
Without the earphones in.
Unmute me. I think so far, you know, what we're hearing, I mean, sometimes it feels, doesn't it, so incredibly overwhelming. How do we combat all of this? You know, whether it's the people being spied on, undercover cops living with people, spying on unions, the horrific story of Julian Assange, but the importance of, fantastic importance of WikiLeaks. And obviously, as Suresh has said, you know, so eloquently, you know, the horrors of, you know, the way in which policing has been carried out and so on, both on them and on others, and the absolute, you know, if we can use the word whitewash of the report by Tony Sewell and others. Can I then move on, folks, to our very last speaker, who doesn't need any introduction? It's John McDonnell. Where are you, John? Have we unmuted you yet, John?
I think you have.
You have, right.
Yeah, okay.
Fantastic, John. Thank you very much for joining us tonight and finishing our group of speakers. Thank you so much.
Okay. I'm at the moment, I'm monitoring the House of Commons because there's a bizarre procedural action I have to take to put amendments down to the finance bill, but I can only do it once the final vote is over, and I'm waiting for that to happen. So I might have to interrupt and do that. And at the same time, I'm monitoring what's happening in the House of Lords on the Overseas Operations Bill. Let me just take you through. Let me just take you through some of the legislation that was been referred to, so we all know what we're talking about. I just say it's nice to see so many comradely faces and people I've worked with over the years, and on a whole range of issues. On Assange, I visited Julian in Belmarsh. For those of you who've been anywhere near Belmarsh or in there, it's a pretty hostile environment in its own right. And when I visited Julian, there'd already, I think that month, Deepa, if I remember, there'd already been at least one suicide on his wing. And that's a common, it's a commonplace tragedy in Belmarsh. I've visited constituents there, and it's been pretty difficult to see how people can even just maintain any element of just keeping themselves together, and the impact on people's mental health is enormous. It's appalling. And with regard to, Suresh has done a brilliant speech in setting out the whole history of what's gone on. He referred to Sukhdev Reel, who's listening, and Sukhdev has run the campaign to find out just the truth about what happened to her son Ricky, her beloved son Ricky, all those years ago. And some of this is tragic, and sometimes it degenerates into farce. Suresh, myself, Sukhdev, and Ricky's uncle Mom, we went into Scotland Yard on one occasion, where we were going to be given copies of files that we could read in reference to ourselves, etc. When we got there, they gave us sheets of paper which were heavily redacted to the point in some instances, if I remember correctly, Suresh, there was, on some pages, there was just one word that was unredacted or one sentence. And then they told us, we said, okay, well, and when we got up to take them away, our individual pages, they stopped us because they thought we might put all the pages together and make up the occasional sentence. And it became as farcical as that. And then they visited Sukhdev and myself and Suresh in my office, the police, to tell us that our campaign had been surveilled by the police. This was at a time when Sukhdev was desperately, absolutely desperately heartbroken, appealing to the police for more resources to investigate effectively the killing of Ricky. And we just didn't have the police resources, yet they were spending police resources on surveilling us. And they told us they invented a new expression. They said, we weren't surveilling you, it was for you, it was collateral intrusion. So in other words, we were surveilling everyone else in the meeting, but we thought we'd surveil you as well, just in case. It was just absolutely appalling. And I just looking around at your faces on the legislation that's going through at the moment, to be honest, if it goes through as it is, the next time we meet could be in an open prison, because just looking at you all, most of you are most probably going to be arrested under this legislation in some form, just because of pursuing your normal political and campaigning activities. I just hope we get a choice of who we share cells with. That's all I can say. Let me just run through it very quickly, because sometimes, you know, when you explain what's happening to people, they don't necessarily believe you what's happening. The first one has been referred to. There's 3 pieces of legislation, but I also want to mention one other act of government that's going on at the moment, which is related to it. The Covert Human Intelligence Sources is no longer a bill, it's an act. It's an act, it's gone through, got royal assent on the 1st of March. And exactly what was said was that this gives immunity to agents of the state in the actions they undertake to the point of criminal activity as well. Now, what Suresh was referring to in terms of the Miting inquiry, that stemmed from a whole host of individual campaigns. I was involved in helping set up the Blacklist Workers Support Group. We had the McLibel people, the women who were so abused by the covert operations that was going on. And a whole range of these campaigns really forced the government to announce an inquiry into this whole issue of Spycops. And we thought, maybe naively, that the inquiry would take place and then the government would listen to the recommendations of the inquiry and maybe legislate to protect people. That hasn't happened. The inquiry is dragged on. And so the government has brought forward its own ideas about what they need to do. And this is all about protecting themselves from effectively criminal activities and abuse of people's human rights. And it is quite remarkable, because we've been trying to say, does this, for example, does this mean that people who are acting as state agents and undertake criminal activities, for example, rape, have they got immunity on that? Well, effectively they have. They can rape, murder, commit whatever crime, and they can be given immunity. And the argument that was put forward by the government, and I have to say also by Keir Starmer, was this was somehow a way of we could regularize the covert operations. Of course it wasn't. It's given an absolute free rein to the state agents to commit crime, as far as we're concerned. But linked to that, and that's what I've been checking tonight as it's gone through, I've been trying to, because we've got some really good people in the House of Lords now, like John Hendy, Shami Chakrabarti and Christine Blow and a whole range of them who are working on this, is the Overseas Operations Bill. What that does, it takes effectively what's in the CHIS bill, the Covert Human Intelligence Sources Bill, it takes that immunity and it gives it to state agents operating overseas. And what's been interesting tonight in the House of Lords, the government's just been defeated. Now we think, oh, that's wonderful. The amendment has gone up to the bill, but this shows you the level that we've reached. What the amendment tonight was put forward, and the government opposed it, but they've been defeated. And it basically says the amendment is to back the introduction of a presumption against prosecution for war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide and torture. What the Lords have done tonight is said you cannot have immunity for war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide and torture. The government opposed it. The government wanted to give immunity to its agents abroad, operating abroad overseas, for war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide and torture. Where the hell have we reached, to be honest, in our society? And I just give one example I've been involved in with regard to this, is that I had a constituent who went to Pakistan, a doctor, a young doctor who went there as a volunteer in a hospital, got picked up, was tortured for 6 weeks. And at the end of each torture session, what he said was 2 people came in with English accents who were obviously MI6 and asked the questions. And he didn't even know what they were asking, to be honest. He hadn't got a clue what they were going on about. And then he got taken out and beaten up again. No, the British state never undertook the torture, but the Pakistan authorities did, but the British state were there to interrogate. That's how it operates. Now, those people who were implicated in that behaviour have got immunity as a result of this legislation if it goes through. And what's interesting, eventually we got the young man home, and it was obvious it's been picked up. Well, they did a sweep and just picked up a whole range of people with the same name, and that was it. It was a fishing expedition. It was an absolute disgrace. But the Overseas Operations Bill does exactly the same. It gives immunity to state agents operating overseas in the same way as the Chiz Bill for those operating here. The third bill, as people have mentioned, is the Police Crime and Sentencing Bill. This is incredibly dangerous for everyone on this Zoom, to be honest, because what it does, it gives police powers now in terms of demonstrations and activities way beyond anything they've had up until now. So a police officer will, on the ground, can make a decision about people being arrested under criminal law if, for example, in the bill, if he believes that they are, and this demonstration or action is causing serious unease, alarm or distress to bystanders. Well, you tell me what demonstration hasn't caused unease to bystanders in some form, because that's the whole point of demonstrations, isn't it? To demonstrate how strongly you feel about something. That's the first thing. But the second thing is in the sentencing element of it. Okay, that's just what happens on that basically, is if you cause serious annoyance, you can get up to 10 years. Up to 10 years. So this was, people have cited the issue about the statues, etc., being pulled down. In this legislation, if you're undertaking forms of action like that, but again, it's interpreted by the police on the ground, the sentencing can be a criminal sentence of up to 10 years imprisonment. This is absolutely staggering. It is just incredible. And if you'd have explained this to people, and even a short while ago, no one would have believed that any government would bring forward what is such a fundamental attack on human rights of human association, of freedom of expression, of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. These are rights fought for actually almost for a millennium. And if you look back at I'm doing a history project at the moment around the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, Jack Cay's rebellion, the period of commotion under Kett, and then the Civil War. These are rights consolidated by those individual revolts that eventually forced governments and the state to be accountable to working people. But the other element, which I'm really worried about as well, is the renewal of the hostile environment with real force. Because what's happening now is that the government is now building the next generation of detention centres. They're looking at detention centre up in the northeast, and all these arguments that they were going to close down Yarlswood, etc., literally have been thrown to the wind. They're now looking at how they can go forward in terms of a new generation of detention centres, but also they continue to come back with these ludicrous ideas of placing asylum seekers on islands offshore elsewhere. And it just goes on. So in addition to the 3 pieces of legislation, you've now got a renewal of the hostile environment with a real vengeance going on. I'm deeply anxious about the whole situation. But the reality is, I'm sorry, I've got to send this email off to get these. The reality is this, that if you're Boris Johnson, Priti Patel or whatever, and you're sitting in a Cobra meeting, and you're planning for the next couple of years whilst you're in government about what you're going to be implementing and what the reaction will be. Well, already you're worried because about people taking action against government policies, because you've already seen Black Lives Matter youngsters on the streets. You've already seen basically campaigning for equality, that's all. You've already seen Extinction Rebellion on the streets, campaigning for a government to tackle the existential threat of climate change. You've seen young women and others in terms of the Me Too campaigns, the Clapham demonstration, etc. Well, the Clapham vigil, that's all it was. But what they've obviously done, they've sat down and they've thought, we're going to be faced with even more of this, particularly because austerity is now rolling on, particularly because the policies that they're implementing, for example, the privatisation of the NHS, the integrated care networks, the crony contracts that are going on, the new wave of austerity that's going to be implemented as a result of the finance bill that's going through tonight at the moment as we speak. Of course, what they're looking at is new waves of protests. So they're bringing forward the most draconian legislation we'll have seen in our lifetimes to tackle that. But in addition to that, and this is the other point we need to recognise, they're also faced and recognising that there's a range of industrial struggles going on at the moment. They thought what would happen under COVID, that somehow industrial action wouldn't take place. It's actually taking place on a scale now that we haven't seen for a number of years. And it's partly as a result of the reaction to policies by employers like fire and rehire, but also as a result of the wage freezes being imposed by central government. So what this government is doing now is recognising they're going to have the potential of literally people taken to the streets, because in opposition to this government, they've got the potential of industrial action on a significant scale. So what they're introducing is the legislation to deal with that challenge to the state and the challenge to this government. And you can see the psychology of this. You can almost overhear the discussions that must be going on amongst them about how they can batten down really to oppose what people, I think, will rightfully be doing, which is trying to oppose this government and every form they possibly can. So that's the motivation for the legislation that's going through and for the range of policies, particularly around the hostile environment and the new range of detention centres. In addition to that, as you know, what they've been doing for the last few years is what they believe is a modernisation of the prison estate as well, but is largely a continuation of the development of larger prisons and under private control. I think we're in the credible reactionary moment at the moment. And I conclude on this is that I quote Harold Lasky all the time. He was the chair of the Labour Party after the Second World War. And he said in one of the speeches he did, he said, you know, fascism in this country won't come through a dictator marching up and down in a military uniform with medals attached to his chest. What will our biggest fear is a form of incremental chopping away and undermining of our basic civil liberties and human rights that eventually results in a form of conservative authoritarianism that actually then was, I think, life-threatening to many people in this country, certainly in terms of threatening to their well-being overall. And I think that we're in that dangerous moment, particularly with a populist right-wing prime minister who has no regard for any of the democratic processes that have been established in this country, fails to have any capacity to distinguish between lie and truth, and on that base, and has surrounded himself with senior ministers like Priti Patel, who will go to extreme lengths to exercise their authority and maintain themselves in power. I'll shut up at that point, Eve. Okay.
John, absolutely superb. I'm gonna.
So good at explaining
Thank
stuff.
you. Thank you.
Well done, John. Well done.
Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, John.
Yeah, John.
So what we're going to do is right. Hi. Am I muted or unmuted? I don't know what I am.